Hey everyone, it's Ethan Grundberg, a regional vegetable specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension's Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program. I'm back with one final video with some of the results from our reduced tillage trials where we've been trying to adapt reduced tillage systems for vine crops from upland mineral soils to muck soils down here in the Black Dirt region of Orange County, New York. If you haven't watched the previous two videos in this series, I encourage you to go back and watch the first one on cover crop performance and the second one on weed management before watching this one, where we're going to focus on crop yield and quality in our research trials.
But when you harvest it, it's clean as a whistle. This year was a dry year. Last year was a wetter year. We stayed right on top with the equipment. The ground wasn't loose. And of course, last year on a wet year, we had clean squash also. I really think we have a little less disease pressure in the squash because I've sprayed very little this year, mainly Bravo, really nothing else, and I had a real good foliage. Had really no problem. The ground that was open, I don't know if it's because if you do get a rain or a wind, the dirt's blowing all over the stuff. I don't know what the reason is, but it just seems you have less problems with the bacteria and everything. And by having it on that ground with the grass, you can put it tighter because you don't need to make the breaks for the cultivation. And I seem to have less cucumber beetle bites that make the bumps on a squash too for some reason. I don't know why.
We've already talked at length about the observed weed management benefits of some of the reduced tillage systems that we've highlighted in these trials, but we also know that crop yield and crop quality are the most important factors that inform growers' decisions on whether to adopt new production systems. For the last 2 years, we've been spending late September evaluating kabocha squash grown in these reduced tillage trial fields. We focused on evaluations on the following: squash weight, squash diameter, the percent of the squash rind covered in soil, the marketability of the squash, and if the squash is not marketable, the reason why it is unmarketable, such as from insect feeding damage, mostly from cucumber beetles, rodent feeding damage, size, immaturity, and rot. The way we collect data on these 5 characteristics of the squash is by harvesting all of the fruit within this 10-foot by 10-foot PVC square at 4 randomly selected locations in each trial field. Each squash is collected, weighed, measured, and assigned a percent of the total surface stained with black dirt. Let's talk about some of the results that we've seen in these trials from this data collection. First, and probably most importantly, let's talk about yield. I want to be very clear from the beginning that the hope in trialing these systems was that we would not see a reduction in yield compared to the conventional tillage bare ground standard for growing vine crops on muck soil, not that we would see an increase in crop yield of any kind. In 2019, we found that our best yielding reduced tillage treatments, which not surprisingly were the same treatments where we saw the best weed suppression, were numerically higher and not statistically different from the conventionally tilled bare ground field. In 2020, I do want to point out that the grower was able to reduce the amount of space between rows of kabocha in the winter rye and fall barley reduced tillage fields, from about 11 feet down to 8 feet, since there was no need to leave space for passes with a perfecta harrow for mechanical cultivation to manage weeds. We were cautiously optimistic that, as a result, we may see a bump in yield per 100 square feet, since there were more plants in that area compared to the bare ground control field. However, as was mentioned in the previous videos, rodents established themselves in the lush rye cover crop over the winter and thinned out the kabocha squash by eating the tender seedlings right after emergence. We estimate that rodents reduced the plant stand in the rye and fall barley fields by about 25 to 30% in 2020. As we can see by looking at the 2020 yield data in this bar graph, despite the rodent damage, there was no statistically significant difference between the yield in the winter rye field and the conventionally tilled bare ground field. We do see that the numerically best yield was in the spring barley reduced tillage field, but again, it was not statistically significantly different from the bare ground control. So even though it may not sound like good news, we can conclude from these trial results that growers should not expect any loss in yield compared to bare ground kabocha production in a well-managed reduced tillage system on black dirt. I should note that the data we've been looking at is just for marketable yield, so anything that had rodent damage, had Phytophthora rot, had an excessive number of cucumber beetle bites on it, or was undersized or immature was left out of those figures. Interestingly, we actually saw very little rodent damage to the fruit at harvest time in the winter rye and fall barley fields, despite the early season damage to emerging seedlings. The treatment with the most rodent damage in our 2020 trials was actually the spring-seeded oats, followed by the spring-seeded barley. Truthfully, though, those two reduced tillage fields were located on a different part of the farm that may have historically had more rodents than the other trial fields. So rodents may cause more damage in reduced tillage systems compared to bare ground, but it hasn't resulted in a reduction in yield in our trial fields. Now, the other bit of data that has been most interesting to growers from these trials is what we've been referring to as the soil staining of squash harvested in the different treatments. As already mentioned, we estimate the percentage of the total surface area covered with soil for each squash that we harvest from that 10-foot by 10-foot PVC square in each field. Many muck squash growers have probably gotten feedback from buyers that their squash harvested on bare ground fields, especially in wetter years, is dirtier than squash grown on mineral soil. One of the primary goals of these research trials was to see if we could improve this aspect of crop quality to improve the competitiveness of muck-grown vine crops with those grown on mineral soils. In 2019, when the harvest season was fairly rainy, we saw a very clear trend toward harvesting cleaner squash from reduced tillage fields compared to the bare ground control field. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we see the cleanest squash in the reduced tillage fields where we measured the most cover crop biomass and had the best weed suppression as a result. All of the fields with spring-seeded oats, including the two that were mixed with Braco white mustard and T-Raptor mustards, had very little soil in the fruit at harvest, with a top-performing treatment of straight oats averaging only 1.86% of the rind stained with black dirt. On the other end of the spectrum, you'll see that the bare ground conventionally tilled field had an average of 19% soil stain on squash at harvest. In 2020, we had far fewer cover crop treatments that we were trialing. However, we still saw the same result. The bare ground conventionally tilled squash was statistically significantly dirtier at harvest in late September when compared to the reduced tillage treatments. Even in a dry year, over 12% of the rind was, on average, stained with black dirt in the bare ground field. In contrast, all of the reduced tillage fields produce squash with 6.5% or less of the fruit covered in soil. By allowing that crop to develop and mature on that mat of mulch from the cover crop residue that was terminated in place, we have been able to consistently reduce the amount of soil staining on kabocha by 50% or more compared to bare ground production.
The scary part is the first time you do it, because you don't think it's going to work, and then but once you get used to it, it's the way to go. The squash comes out phenomenally clean on cover crop squash. You don't see the bumps in it. It's clean. It's just day and night difference. My future of doing it, I think, is with cover crops. For the simple reason, your squash comes out, you can be competitive with everybody else. We could be competitive with Canada. Canada has beautiful, clean kabocha squash. Now, by doing these cover crops, ours is coming as clean as theirs. And you don't see the bumps on the squash nowhere as near as much as you do on just bare ground.
Transitioning to reduced tillage vine crop production on the black dirt is not going to make sense for everyone. Successfully adopting these systems takes time and effort to thoughtfully and effectively modify your seeding equipment, prioritize establishing uniform stands of cover crops on the right seeding dates, giving those cover crops enough time to produce sufficient biomass in the spring, and making sure to be aware of historical rodent pressure in the fields to minimize the risk for damage. However, the past few years of field trialing with grower cooperators on the black dirt like Lou and Joe Jadis, David Morgevich, Joe Sidoti, and Paul Verskevich have convinced me that these reduced tillage systems can be effectively adopted on muck soils to improve weed management and improve crop quality without sacrificing yield. This work has been made possible by support from a USDA specialty crop block grant administered by the New York Farm Viability Institute. Thanks especially to the grower cooperators who have participated in this research and to Sarah Tobin for editing this video. Be sure to check out the Cornell Cooperative Extension Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program website for more information on our work, enych.cce.cornell.edu.